He thought he could control her every move, every thought, every feeling, but she was smarter than he imagined. Watch as manipulation unravels and the truth finally comes to light.
I've always believed I understood people, maybe too well. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing how someone will react before they even realize it themselves, and seeing the little cracks in their armor, the soft spots where they are vulnerable, the points where they can be moved. I met Laura on an ordinary Thursday evening at a cafe that smelled faintly of roasted coffee and sugar. She was sitting alone, scrolling through her phone, her hair falling in a casual cascade over her shoulders, and I noticed immediately the way she tilted her head when she read something funny, the way her eyes sparkled just slightly before a smile spread across her face. That small moment told me everything I needed to know. She was someone who trusted, someone who didn't expect deception, someone who believed in the good intentions of others. She would be easy to shape. I approached her with a confidence I didn't feel entirely, but perfected over years of careful observation. I smiled, asked if I could join her, and when she looked up hesitant but polite, I slid into the chair across from her as if we had known each other for years. Conversation flowed effortlessly, or at least I made sure it did, guiding the words, the pauses, the laughter, in ways that made her lean in, nod, share little secrets about herself that were safe enough to reveal, yet telling enough to learn who she was. She spoke of her work, her friends, her small disappointments, and I nodded at the right times, laughed softly at her jokes, and told just enough about myself to seem honest, but never enough to expose weakness. She wanted someone who understood her. I became that person, almost instantly. I learned her routines, the way she checked her phone first thing in the morning, the coffee she preferred, how she never ordered the same sandwich twice. I remember thinking, not with malice at first, but with an almost academic curiosity, how simple it would be to guide her, to influence her decisions without her noticing. And so I began small. A suggestion here, a compliment there, a tiny act of generosity that created a silent ledger in her mind, an obligation she didn't even realize she was accruing. Buy her coffee once a week, and suddenly she's thanking me more than necessary. Offered to help with a work task, and she smiles in a way that lingers long after the conversation ends. It's subtle, barely noticeable, but it works. People are predictable if you know where to look. I made sure to never push too hard, to never show all my cards. Trust, after all, is built gradually, not forced. I learned her vulnerabilities, but I also learned her joys, her small pleasures, the way she would talk about a movie that moved her or a book she loved, and I mirrored her enthusiasm. That mirror effect, psychologists call it rapport building, but I simply called it practical. Every smile she gave me, every laugh, every little confession became fuel for the longer game I intended to play. I didn't intend to hurt her immediately. No, the real power comes slowly, like a tide that rises imperceptibly until it surrounds you completely. The first time I truly exercised control, she didn't even realize it had happened. She mentioned a friend canceling plans, sounding disappointed but polite, and I suggested we go out together instead, casually, not as a replacement, but as an option. She agreed almost gratefully, and I noticed how her plans now rotate around mine without me having said a word. That was the moment I knew. Influence doesn't require force, only guidance, patience, and the ability to make someone feel like the choice was theirs all along. It wasn't always perfect. There were times she hesitated, moments when intuition prickled at the edge of her awareness, but those were rare, and when they appeared, I managed them with what I considered finesse. A compliment, a shared memory of my own, a small admission of vulnerability on my part, enough to disarm any suspicion and reestablish trust. She began to rely on my judgment, seeking my advice on things she never would have shared with anyone else. And with every piece of trust she offered, the web tightened around her. I wasn't cruel. I told myself I was careful, attentive, considerate. Manipulation, in my mind, was simply an art form, a way to orchestrate life so that it unfolded predictably, beautifully, as I intended. As weeks turned into months, I noticed subtle changes in her behavior that amused me and satisfied my sense of control. She started deferring to my opinion on small choices: what to eat, what movie to watch, even what color curtains she should buy for her apartment. It began innocently enough, and she never saw the pattern forming. People rarely do. What is invisible when you are inside it seems obvious only in hindsight. I would watch her smile when I made a suggestion, nodding as if she had come to the decision herself, and felt a peculiar sense of pride. This was the elegance of it. She believed she was free, while in reality, every step she took was on a path I had subtly laid out. But it wasn't just control over decisions, it was emotional as well. I learned to sow doubt without confrontation, to inject small insecurities that made her seek reassurance from me. A casual mention of a friend she admired, a compliment to another man in passing, and I would sigh, half joking, and remark on how lucky I was that she was with me. She would laugh, perhaps nervous, and immediately assure me, without prompting, that there was no one like me, that I was important. It was brilliant in a way that frightened even me when I admitted it quietly to myself. And yet, I didn't rush. Patience is everything. The longer the trust builds, the deeper the dependence, the more powerful the eventual sway becomes. I watched her grow comfortable, confiding in me about fears she never shared with friends, speaking openly about dreams I subtly encouraged, guiding them, reshaping them so that the outcomes aligned with my vision. She called it love. I called it a practice of careful attention and influence, the art of reading someone so well that they began to move as you expected before even knowing why. Of course, I had to be careful. Too much control, too overt a move, and the illusion would shatter. People are fragile when they feel manipulated, and suspicion can unravel months of careful work in moments. So I was measured, gentle, always making sure she felt appreciated, adored, and never trapped. In the beginning, she laughed at herself when she realized how much she relied on me, how often she asked for my opinion before acting. But that laughter only confirmed what I already knew. She was mine to guide, without ever having to claim ownership openly. And in those quiet moments, when she wasn't looking, when she slept peacefully, or smiled thinking of me, I felt a power unlike any I had known before. Not in a cruel way, at least not entirely, but in the perfect symmetry of influence. The satisfaction came from the knowledge that someone so intelligent, so perceptive, so independent in every other aspect of life had, without realizing it, let me shape the course of her days, her choices, her emotions. It was intoxicating. I remember telling myself repeatedly that this was harmless, that it was the natural dynamic between two people who cared deeply about each other. But even then, in the quiet, I understood that what I had set in motion was more than affection, more than guidance. It was control, a subtle weaving of her world into mine, a tapestry that only I could fully comprehend. And I smiled at the thought, knowing that the game had only just begun.
By the time we had been together for a few months, the lines between affection and control had blurred so completely that I almost believed it was natural. I told myself it was love, the way I carefully guided Laura's choices, the way I encouraged certain friendships and subtly discouraged others. But it was more than that. It was the thrill of knowing I could shape her reality without ever making her feel coerced. The power was in the invisible hand, the gentle nudges, the way a question framed just so could make her doubt her own instincts. I found it fascinating, almost scientific. Every reaction was data, every hesitation a clue. It started small, as all things do. I planted little seeds of doubt about her ex-boyfriends, mentioning incidents she had never thought were significant, twisting them subtly so she began to see patterns that weren't really there. "Do you remember how he said that?" I'd ask softly, leaning close so my voice carried intimacy as well as suggestion. I always wondered if he really meant it. Her brows would furrow, a tiny crease of worry appearing, and she would nod, often looking down at her hands. That was when I knew the idea had taken root. She wouldn't confront me. Instead, she'd ruminate silently, and I would watch the process with quiet satisfaction. I also learned how to manage her expectations without seeming controlling. When she spoke about ambitions, I listened intently, sometimes offering guidance, other times suggesting alternatives that served my sense of order. I never imposed, not openly, but by framing options in a way that subtly biased the outcomes. I shaped decisions so they aligned with the reality I preferred. I noticed how often she began seeking my approval before acting, asking questions she might have once dismissed as trivial. Every yes she gave, every reassurance she sought, reinforced the pattern. The most fascinating part was emotional manipulation. I learned how to alternate warmth and distance, affection and mild disapproval, creating a rhythm that made her crave my presence and validation. A delayed response to a message, a casual remark about how I missed her, a fleeting expression of disappointment over a minor issue, all served to heighten her attention to me. Humans are creatures of emotional patterns. We respond instinctively to cues that signal reward or loss. By controlling those cues, I controlled her emotional environment, and she didn't even realize it. Sometimes I wondered if she suspected. Occasionally, she would glance at me with that almost imperceptible flicker of doubt in her eyes. But even then, I had rehearsed answers, excuses, explanations that made her second-guess herself. "I'm just concerned," I'd say, smiling softly, taking her hand, and she'd relax, her defenses melting like snow under sunlight. The real trick was to never appear as the manipulator, to let her believe that every suggestion, every slight correction, every carefully framed observation came from care and love, not strategy. I also found it rewarding to see how she began altering small habits to align with my preferences. The way she arranged her apartment, the books she read, even the music she played when I was around started to reflect my tastes. And she thought it was organic, a natural evolution of our compatibility. No one noticed the subtle nudges, the carefully timed suggestions, the chance comments I dropped just frequently enough to influence decisions. It was elegant, like conducting an orchestra where every note was mine to control. Of course, maintaining this level of influence required constant attention. I monitored her social interactions, noting who she spent time with, who she called often, and who she avoided. I never forbade friendships, not directly, but I could steer her choices with well-placed remarks or questions. "Do you really trust him?" I might ask, casually, about a colleague she mentioned admiring. Or I'd point out small inconsistencies in stories she heard from friends. She would internalize these observations and come to me for guidance, asking for reassurance or advice. Each time, the net tightened, though I never let her feel trapped. Control, I reminded myself, was most effective when invisible. The thrill came not from cruelty, but from seeing the system work perfectly. She laughed, trusted, confided, and adapted to my nudges with almost mechanical precision. She believed in me completely, and it was intoxicating to watch. I told myself it was harmless, that it was our connection, our unique bond, and sometimes I even believed it. I rationalized it in moments of quiet self-reflection, convincing myself that my attentiveness, my guidance, my subtle influence was simply the mark of someone who truly understood her. Yet, despite my careful orchestration, cracks began to appear. It started with a small incident. She hesitated over a decision I had subtly guided. Normally, she would have accepted my suggestion without question, but this time she paused, looked at me differently. "Are you sure this is what I want?" she asked, a hint of suspicion creeping into her voice. I smiled, offered reassurances, and she nodded, but the seed of doubt had taken root. By me, ironically, through overconfidence. It was a reminder that even the most carefully constructed control could falter, that human intuition is persistent, even when manipulated. I learned to adapt. I shifted strategies, introduced subtle confusion, minor contradictions, anything to make her rely on my perspective to resolve uncertainty. I framed options in such a way that her need for clarity always led back to me. and it worked for a while. But I sensed that she was not entirely oblivious anymore. Her eyes, once full of trust, began to narrow slightly in contemplation. Her questions became more probing, her gratitude less spontaneous. I had underestimated the resilience of her awareness, and for the first time in months, a flicker of unease passed through me. I remember one evening vividly. We were having dinner at a small Italian restaurant, one I had recommended weeks prior because it was quiet and easy to control the atmosphere. She hesitated over a menu item, then asked casually, almost playfully, "Do you always know what's best for me?" My heart skipped and I laughed it off, brushing it aside, but I noticed the glint in her eyes. It was the first real challenge, the first recognition that perhaps I wasn't entirely the benevolent guide I had presented myself as. I smiled, offered the suggestion with more warmth than usual, and she agreed. But her smile lacked the unguarded delight I was used to. I realized at that moment that the game was evolving, and she might be evolving too. I reveled in the challenge secretly. The risk made the game more thrilling. I began to anticipate her suspicions, crafting explanations and diversions, subtle stories that would make her doubt her doubts. I carefully measured my attention, alternating warmth and cool detachment, so she would seek reassurance, consult me, depend on me even more. It was a delicate dance, one step forward, two steps back, a rhythm only I could control. Or so I believed. But beneath my satisfaction, a tiny nagging thought lingered. What if she eventually saw through it completely? What if all my careful planning, all my subtle influence, all my carefully constructed persona collapsed under the weight of her awareness? I pushed the thought aside. Control was power, and I had refined it into an art form. For now, the system worked. I was still in command, and the intoxicating sense of mastery carried me through the evening, leaving only the faintest hint of tension under the surface. A prelude, perhaps, to challenges I would face in the coming days.
It had been almost 6 months since Laura and I had become inseparable, or at least that's how I perceived it. To everyone else, we were the perfect couple, affectionate in public, attentive in private, laughing easily and seamlessly. I had constructed an image of harmony so convincing that even I occasionally believed it. But behind closed doors, the intricate dance of influence, suggestion, and control continued unabated. Every interaction, every decision, every small victory in shaping her thoughts and choices was both thrilling and meticulously calculated. At first, her occasional questioning seemed insignificant, almost amusing. A glance here, a subtle hesitation there, a question laced with curiosity. "Do you really think I should do this?" I responded with patience, charm, and reassurance, maintaining the facade of the caring partner. I allowed her to believe that I was merely offering guidance, not dictating her life. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, those tiny sparks of suspicion began to grow, coalescing into something more tangible, more threatening to my constructed dominance. One evening, she returned from work looking unusually pensive, a subtle crease in her brow that made me pause. She set her bag down quietly, poured herself a glass of wine, and took a slow sip before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about my friend, Alex." Her voice was measured, cautious, as if testing the waters. My heart skipped, but my expression remained calm. I tilted my head, offering the exact amount of concern, the exact level of curiosity. "Yes?" I prompted gently. She continued, "I don't know, I just feel like sometimes you're too involved in my decisions, like you're shaping them in ways I don't fully see." There it was, the moment I had feared, though I had expected it eventually. I smiled, a blend of warmth and understanding, and reached for her hand. "I'm just looking out for you," I said softly, making sure my tone carried empathy rather than defensiveness. "I want what's best for you. You know that." She nodded slowly, but her eyes flickered with doubt, an emotion I had seldom seen before. From that point on, I realized that the game had changed. She was no longer entirely unaware. I had to adapt, refine, and escalate my methods to maintain influence. I began planting small inconsistencies in conversations, subtly introducing ideas that would encourage her to check with me more frequently, to rely on me to resolve uncertainty.
I complimented her independence while simultaneously highlighting the benefits of my guidance. It was a delicate balance, pushing her toward dependence without triggering outright resistance. Her friends began noticing subtle shifts as well. Comments like, "You seem to check with him a lot," or "Are you sure you're making your own choices?" were met with defensive laughs or casual reassurances from Laura, but I knew she heard them, and I could see the internal conflict in her eyes. It fascinated me, the way she processed external opinions, weighed them against her feelings, and yet often returned to me for validation. My hold was still strong, but the seeds of doubt were sprouting. I started testing her limits, small experiments designed to gauge the strength of my influence. If she wanted to meet a friend, I'd suggest an alternative that aligned with my plans, presented as a subtle preference rather than a directive. If she hesitated, I would feign disappointment. Not overtly, just enough for her to interpret and respond. Most times she conformed willingly, but the occasional resistance sent a thrill through my mastery. The dance was becoming more intricate, more challenging, and I relished the intellectual stimulation. And yet I began noticing cracks in the armor of my control. Little things, her asking more pointed questions, a lingering look when I offered suggestions, subtle sighs of contemplation. I realized that while I had carefully orchestrated her perception of freedom, she was beginning to see the strings. She hadn't yet confronted me, but the awareness was there, simmering beneath the surface. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and compelling all at once. The most delicate situation arose one weekend when we attended a small gathering at a mutual friend's house. I had advised her on her outfit, the time we should arrive, even how to engage with certain people, all under the guise of helpfulness. But during the evening, she smiled at another man, lingered in conversation, and for the first time, I felt a pang of real uncertainty. The control I had relied on was faltering, and I needed to act carefully. A direct confrontation would be disastrous. Subtle influence was required more than ever. I approached her gently, suggested a change in the flow of the evening, offered a lighthearted critique that masked underlying control, and she acquiesced. But I noticed the way she glanced at me, a hint of recognition in her eyes, as if she had begun to see that my guidance was not entirely benign. It was a small victory for her awareness and a warning for me. The game was no longer one-sided. Returning home that night, I reflected on my methods, on the careful construction of influence, on the balance of warmth and detachment. I realized that while my control had been precise and effective, it had limits. Human intuition is persistent, resilient, and capable of piercing veils of subtlety. I had underestimated the very person I sought to guide, to shape, to dominate. Yet the thrill remained, because even in the presence of doubt, even as suspicion grew, I could still manipulate, still steer, still maintain a semblance of authority. Sleep was restless. I lay beside her, pretending to doze, while her presence reminded me that my mastery was not absolute. She stirred, whispered my name in the dark, and I responded with the practiced tenderness that had lulled her into trust from the beginning. But beneath the surface, I recognized that a shift had occurred. The dynamic had changed. The predator I had been, operating with near complete control, now faced a prey who was awakening, slowly but surely, to the reality of the cage I had built around her. I could no longer rely on simple patterns. She was learning, observing, questioning, testing boundaries. Each interaction required greater precision, more nuance, more strategy. And yet, I continued, because the game was intoxicating, because mastery over another's perception is a heady elixir, and because I had convinced myself that I could maintain it indefinitely.
The change was subtle at first, a fleeting glance, a pause in conversation, but it became unmistakable over time. Laura was no longer merely following my suggestions or deferring to my opinions without question. She began double-checking herself, lingering over decisions she once made instinctively, sometimes looking at me with that sharp, calculating gaze I had only glimpsed a few times before. It unnerved me. I had always assumed that once trust is established, influence becomes permanent. Yet here was proof that even the most carefully woven web could fray at the edges.
One afternoon, she asked to borrow my laptop. It seemed innocent, but I noticed the way she hesitated before speaking, the slight tremor in her fingers and the careful measurement of her words. "I just want to check something. About us," she said, eyes flicking briefly to mine. My stomach tightened. That phrase, casual as it sounded, carried the weight of suspicion. "Of course," I replied smoothly, masking the tension I felt. "Take whatever you need." Inside, I felt a cold surge of anxiety, realizing she might be seeking evidence, clues, perhaps proof of things I had hoped remained invisible. That night, I watched her from across the room as she typed, fingers moving deliberately, eyes focused, occasionally glancing at me as though testing whether I suspected. I tried to maintain my calm, to radiate nonchalance, but a part of me recognized that the game was shifting. The predator I had been, the orchestrator of her perceptions and choices, was facing a challenge he had not anticipated. And strangely, that challenge excited me as it threatened to unravel months of careful control. Over the following days, her behavior became increasingly meticulous. She asked more questions, sometimes casually, sometimes pointedly, about interactions I had orchestrated, about suggestions I had made. "Did you really mean that? Or were you trying to influence me?" she asked one evening, holding my gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I smiled, the practiced charm masking the panic I felt inside. "I meant every word," I said gently, taking her hand, "but I suppose it's natural to question intentions." Yet her eyes did not fully soften. The doubt was growing, persistent and keen, probing into corners I had believed secure. I realized then that subtlety alone would not be enough. She was becoming aware of the patterns, recognizing the rhythm of my influence, noticing the invisible strings I had so carefully hidden. The thrill of control was now tinged with genuine fear, the fear of exposure, of losing the game I had dominated for so long. I had underestimated her intuition, the intelligence that had initially seemed so malleable, so easily guided. One evening, she confronted me directly, in a way that left no room for misdirection. "I've been thinking a lot about how our relationship works," she began, her voice steady but firm, eyes locked on mine. "Sometimes I feel like I'm being guided, influenced without realizing it. I need to understand, is that true?" My pulse quickened, but my expression remained calm, almost serene. "I care about you, and I guide because I want the best for us, but I'd never manipulate you." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, though the shadow in her eyes remained. That night, I lay awake, replaying every interaction, every suggestion, every carefully placed comment. I saw the cracks, the small but growing evidence that she was piecing together the truth. The realization that my control was not absolute hit me with unexpected force. For the first time, I felt vulnerable in a way I had never experienced before. She was no longer the compliant participant I had meticulously shaped. She was awakening, analyzing, questioning. Her actions became more calculated. She began keeping track of inconsistencies, noting discrepancies in my stories, subtle contradictions in my explanations. She asked friends about things I had mentioned in passing, checked details I had assumed went unnoticed. I noticed the shift immediately, the subtle distancing, the careful observation, the way she moved through her days with a new, quiet scrutiny. My influence, once effortless and absolute, required more effort, more finesse, more vigilance than ever. The tension escalated when she discovered evidence I had left unintentionally. A text, a misplaced note, something small but revealing. Her eyes widened when she realized the implication, and I could see in that moment that the predator and the prey had reversed roles. She had found a foothold in the delicate construct I had built, and from that foothold she could challenge me. I tried to recover, to maintain the facade, to deflect and explain, but I knew some damage was irreversible. In the following days, I noticed her interactions shifting, not just with me, but with friends, colleagues, anyone who could confirm or contradict her suspicions. She began to reconstruct her reality with meticulous care, carefully separating my words from my actions, questioning the motives behind every compliment, every suggestion, every guiding comment. And with each revelation, I felt the walls of my influence crumble, brick by brick, under the weight of her growing awareness. The final confrontation was inevitable. One evening, she gathered the courage and clarity to speak openly, to confront me not with doubt, but with evidence. "I know what you've been doing," she said, voice steady, unwavering. "I've seen the patterns, traced the manipulations, and I won't let them continue. You underestimated me." My heart raced. My mind scrambled for defenses, but there was no charm, no deflection, no subtlety that could reverse the moment. The game, the control, the thrill, all collapsed under the sheer clarity of her understanding. I realized then that true mastery over another person is fleeting. Influence can be built, nurtured, and maintained, but it is never permanent. People are not passive elements in a system. They observe, adapt, resist, and sometimes strike back. Laura's awakening was proof of that enduring truth. My carefully orchestrated web of control, my months of subtle guidance, my pride in my perceived mastery, all had unraveled before her determination and intelligence. By the end of that confrontation, I was forced to acknowledge the consequences of my actions. I had believed in the perfection of my plan, in the elegance of influence without detection, but she had shown me the limits, the ethical boundaries, and the resilience of human awareness. The predator had been outwitted by the very person he sought to dominate, and the lesson was unavoidable, undeniable.
By the time the final confrontation came, there was no pretense left. No subtle manipulation, no hidden agenda that could save me. Laura's eyes held a clarity and determination I had never seen before, a quiet but undeniable authority over her own life that left me exposed and powerless. I had spent months believing myself untouchable, the orchestrator of her choices, the invisible hand guiding her thoughts and actions. But she had learned, adapted, and observed, and now I faced the consequences of my own arrogance. She spoke calmly, yet every word cut through the carefully constructed veil I had built. "I trusted you," she said, "but trust isn't permission to manipulate. You've crossed the line and I won't allow it anymore." Her voice did not waver, and in that moment, I realized that my influence, once so intoxicating and complete, was gone. All the small victories, the carefully guided decisions, the emotional nudges, they amounted to nothing against her clarity and resolve. I tried to respond, to justify my actions, to frame them as care, attention, and affection. But she listened without interruption, her focus unwavering, and I felt the futility of my words immediately. "Love isn't control," she said simply, a statement so basic and yet so devastating in its truth. "It's respect, honesty, and freedom. You confused all of that with manipulation, and now it's over." I sat in silence, stripped of all pretense, confronting for the first time the reality I had never anticipated. I was no longer the one in control. Over the next few days, I watched her reclaim her autonomy, her decisions no longer swayed by my suggestions or subtle cues. She organized her own schedule, made choices freely, and interacted with friends and colleagues without the invisible hand I had thought omnipresent. Every time I attempted even the slightest influence, she deflected with awareness and confidence, a reflection of the growth and resilience I had never credited her with. The realization stung. All my careful planning, my patience, my psychological games, useless in the face of genuine self-awareness and resolve. She did not seek revenge, nor did she publicly shame me. Instead, she simply reasserted her independence, leaving me to confront the emptiness of my own actions. The lessons were unavoidable. I had learned in the harshest way possible that influence built on deception and control is fragile, fleeting, and ultimately self-defeating. People see through patterns, detect motives, and reclaim agency when they recognize manipulation. I had underestimated her, and that miscalculation had cost me everything. The final moments we shared were quiet, almost mundane. She packed her belongings from the apartment we had shared, moved them into a space of her own, and made it clear that the relationship was over. There was no anger, no dramatics, only the firm assertion of boundaries and the restoration of her own life. I watched, powerless as she walked away, the culmination of months of subtle control and manipulation undone by her insight and courage.
In the aftermath, I was left to reflect on my actions, on the ethical boundaries I had ignored, on the arrogance that had convinced me I could master another person's life. The power I had wielded, intoxicating as it had been ephemeral, collapsing under the weight of awareness and truth. I realized that control, when exercised without consent or respect, is not strength, it is vulnerability. And the person who seeks to dominate may find themselves outmaneuvered by the very individual they sought to shape. Months later, I would see glimpses of her life through mutual friends or social media, always happy, independent, unburdened by my influence. And though part of me still marveled at the precision of my own methods, the more lasting impression was respect for her resilience, her intelligence, and her courage. She had not only survived my manipulation, she had grown stronger because of it, reclaiming her autonomy and demonstrating a strength I had foolishly assumed she lacked. In the end, the story was not about me, nor about my attempts to control or shape another person. It was about her awakening, her resistance, and the unassailable truth that true influence cannot exist without respect and consent. The thrill of control, the intoxicating satisfaction of guiding another's thoughts and emotions was meaningless in the face of awareness, integrity, and self-determination.